Thank you, everybody. Our Ambassadors Roundtable is a tradition at the Washington International Trade Conference, and we're so pleased to welcome here today Ambassador Moctezuma of Mexico, Ambassador Liu of Singapore, Ambassador Crespo-Sancho of Costa Rica, Ambassador Neliupšienė, appointed ambassador of the EU to the United States, and our moderator, Ambassador Kristen Silverberg, the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable. Kristen?
Great, thank you, Ken, and thank you to WITC for having us here today. This panel, the Ambassadors panel, has become a tradition at WITC, which I am delighted to help continue. I'm particularly excited because the topic we're discussing today, the role of trade in advancing foreign policy, is a critical one for the ongoing debate in the U.S. about our approach to trade agreements. There was a time not too long ago when U.S. administrations would unapologetically tout the national security and foreign policy benefits of trade, but that line of argument has gone out of fashion in parts of Washington. When you hear officials from the Trump or the Biden administrations talking about the connection between national security and trade, they're likely to be talking about the national security risks of trade rather than the ways that trade can be used to advance U.S. foreign policy interests. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to put this issue to some of our closest trading partners to ask them how they think about these connections, how they think about the role of their own trade agreements, including their trade agreements with us. And so let me get started. Ambassador Moctezuma, I want to start with you. And I want to start with this issue of friend shoring. We obviously, lots of people in the U.S. government, lots of U.S. companies are worried about supply chain risk, including, not limited to, but including geopolitical risk. And of course, we have a trade agreement with Mexico that's helping to advance friend shoring. How do you think about this trend, and what do you think we need to do to take full advantage of this opportunity?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen, and I think that we are true believers in trade in Mexico. We just became the partner number one of the U.S. Last year with about $800 billion in trade. And if we are partners number one of the U.S., that means that we have an incredible effort in both countries in order to have this nearshoring trend. Last year also, Mexico received the most important foreign investment, the direct foreign investment in its history. And what is very interesting is that many of the companies that have invested in Mexico, besides nearshoring, they are looking for human capital. If you speak with the people of Tesla, Tesla announced its new factory in Nuevo León. They say that they found out that they would have a source of very well-prepared engineers in Mexico that will work for their factory in Nuevo León, and that was one of the most important aspects to have that investment there. Another thing that I can say is that when Mexico exports, we have 40% of U.S. previous imports. So when Mexico exports, the U.S. is also exporting. And what this shows you is that Mexico and the U.S. are not just trade partners, but that we are producing together. Mm-hmm. There are many, many, many companies and there are many products that come and go several times in the border, and that they are produced together. So it's not just trade, it's an economic integration.
Wonderful, thank you. Ambassador Crespo-Sancho, let me turn to you and ask you about your Costa Rica's trading relationship with the U.S. When President Bush signed CAFTA-DR in 2004, he unapologetically cited the national security or the foreign policy strategic benefits. He talked about the fact that it would impact U.S. influence in the region, that it would promote stability, and so on. I think the economic benefits of the deal have been clear. Our own bilateral trade has really expanded. But do you think that it's also met some of the expectations in terms of strategic benefit? Can you just talk about the broader consequences of CAFTA-DR?
Sure. I want to start with, part of my job is to talk to everyone on the Hill and talk to everyone. And one of the first things that people ask, or when I ask them about Costa Rica, they just think about, a place to go to visit, most of the pineapples that you get here and bananas so, but pineapples are from Costa Rica. And when I tell them, actually our number one export are medical devices, people think like, what do you mean? Oh, I didn't know Costa Rica did that. And I'm like, oh yes, we do. We have one, and it is, CAFTA has been a success story for Costa Rica. Not only medical devices, that's just an example, because also semiconductors and many other things. Let's start with Costa Rica, even before CAFTA, has had very strong friendship, working relationships with the United States. But CAFTA-DR actually helped expand those relationships, not only with the United States, but also within Central America and Dominican Republic, which is a big plus. We do have two vibrant sectors. Again, I have mentioned them already, the medical devices, which are also close to national security of the United States, and semiconductors. I can even tell you that Intel last year in August, they announced a $1.2 billion investment in the next 2 years in Costa Rica, and that little teeny tiny country that people just think about going to travel, which is also great. Please go. It's a 4.5-hour flight from here. But again, what are the challenges that we're having? This is, about 20 years ago. What are the challenges today is that there's political challenges within the Central American region that probably makes CAFTA, although it's still very beneficial for all the countries, including Costa Rica, which is why Costa Rica is trying to open up to get, why don't we start looking into other options? So let me give you a little bit of an insight of how slow we are. I don't know if you've heard the saying in Costa Rica, pura vida, that everything is pure life, like, oh yeah. So we're slow, but we get there. What do I mean with that? Because you can get slow and not do or not get to where you need to go. We decided to be part of OECD, the highest standards, some of the highest standards in the world. It took us 10 years. When we first started, which actually the Minister of Trade, the current Minister of Trade was part of that, they said, no, you guys are crazy. Costa Rica has to go through a lot of, Congress, changes in laws, regulations. 10 years later, we did it. As of 2 years, we're part of OECD countries. So that means that Costa Rica can even join, let's say, USMCA. Why not? USMCA has pretty good high standards. Costa Rica can get to those standards. So CAFTA-DR prepared us for that, which is, again, that doesn't mean that if we start with other trade agreements, that doesn't mean that we're going to leave one behind. But it's going to, if we can give more and we can have higher standards, if a country can do that, why not?
Thank you. Ambassador Lee, let me ask you about Singapore's trade agenda. While the U.S. has moved away from negotiating traditional trade agreements, Singapore has charged ahead. You've now implemented 27 FTAs. Within Singapore, do you think of those as just part of your economic agenda, or do you also think about them as part of a foreign policy tool?
Well, I would start off by saying that trade is 3 times the GDP in Singapore. So you obviously know the position that I would take. And I believe in the rules-based multilateral trading system, how it was forged by the US coming out of World War II and has over the decades contributed, I think, immensely to international stability, economic growth, allowing countries large and small to reap efficiencies of scale, productivity, dividends from innovation, and so on. I think in our part of the world, we have seen how trade has fueled domestic development, but also regional, even global integration amongst economies. When we talk about foreign policy, domestic support for foreign policy is really important. And that's so for every country. And I think trade has, for a number of decades, been one of those areas where you can see concrete results arising from the foreign relations, from the agreements that we signed. And certainly the benefits in the early decades of globalization may have masked some of the problems that we see today, the distributive inequalities and inefficiencies arising from globalization that all societies have to tackle. But nonetheless, I think if you take it in its totality, the multilateral rules-based trading system has been a plus for almost all countries. Maybe a little bit about Singapore and the US, because this year we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the free trade agreement between our two countries, first established in 2004. And if I take it to the latest year when we have good trade data, 2022, over those 18 years, actually trade between our two countries has grown 3 times, from about 70 billion at its inception to now about 210 billion US dollars. By the way, the US enjoys a very healthy surplus of Singapore, which may come in useful next year depending on how things shape up. And the US runs a surplus, both in trade in goods as well as a trade in services. So it's not one masking the other. But also as a result of the free trade agreement, we have close to 6,000 US companies in Singapore, using us as a regional headquarters for some of them, but Singapore as a springboard to the larger region and reaping the benefits of the integration that we see in ASEAN and across larger Asian economies. Investments from US into Singapore, just to give you a sense of what it is like, cumulative FDI over the years, is close to about $500 billion US dollars, right? What does that mean? It means that the cumulative stock of US FDI in Singapore is larger than the US FDI into China, Japan, and South Korea combined, okay? And so when I say that actually there's a lot of economic skin in the game for US to remain deeply vested in our part of the world, I think you'll understand what it is that I'm saying.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Neliupšienė, you have a foreign policy background from Lithuania. What are your reflections on this broad question of the role of trade in advancing foreign policy?
Well, thank you for the question, and I would like to pick where the president of the Manufacturers Association actually left, because his last statement was extremely, I think, to the point, saying that if we want to advance, or if we want to move together with our trade and make sure that our foreign policy agenda or our security agenda moves in the same vein or in parallel, we have to do those two together. Mm-hmm. And because, we probably, there is between the transatlantic, in the transatlantic relations, one of the things is values. It's a value-based partnership. First of all, we were the ones who together built international rules and order and international organizations, and I think that we probably have to appreciate more how it works, because, the trade probably, as we see right now in the modern age, would not be the same if we don't have those international rules and and the organizations associated there. My colleague was talking about OECD, but there are standards of WTO which we have to adhere, and many more. And if we look at the geopolitics, what is happening right now in the world, I think it's getting scarier with each day. The turbulences, the conflicts around the world actually has a huge implication on our economy. On one hand, it's definitely challenges, the prices, inflation, distorted supply chains, anything you want. But on the other hand, when you have reliable trading partners, if you have really a strong and resilient transatlantic relation, you can see that even during the crisis, the most severe crisis, you actually see the trade growing. So if last year we had 1.3 trillion euros between EU and US 2 years ago. So last year will be almost 5% higher. Slowly but steadily growing up. And one of the reasons was that in Europe we had to make a huge change in the energy sector because European over-reliance on Russian energy resources had to be solved as the issue. And don't underestimate how much it costs in organizing that, making sure that you don't freeze and your people don't freeze during the winter, the last one. And on top of that, you have to find where to buy new resources, and here comes where alliances matters. Most of the the growth of the trade is actually due to that EU buys a lot of LNG. It's and when you need to switch fast, if you need to change more than 60% of your energy resources, you have to pay the price, and you have to rely on your allies. And I think this actually is supposed to speak for itself. And we can go, sector by sector. Semiconductors had been mentioned. We can go into the connectivity sector and think, if you want to find alternatives, or if you want to have a reliable, secure production line, I think, you will always depend on your most on the partners of Secretary Blinken called on the partners of the first resort.
Let me stay with you. So the U.S. and Europe have a history of using our combined economic influence to work together to address national security risks and foreign policy objectives, sometimes using trade tools in cooperation with each other. Do you think we're in lockstep on China? And if not, where do you see differences?
Well, I think that the biggest difference is probably more rhetorical than on the paper and in reality. First of all, of course, EU approaches China as a trading partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival. And I think that you can use different words or different synonyms, and you will find that actually a U.S. approach is not very much different. Your head of national security advisor spoke about their small backyards, high walls or high fences. We as well have just a couple of weeks ago, at the end of January, you produced an economic security strategy, which actually in general includes 4 major sectors which we want to de-risk with China, be it semiconductors, high power computing, quantum computing, biotech. So AI, So I don't, even in the sector-wise, we are actually quite close. And of course, this includes making sure, dual-use goods are not going, so export control, strengthening investment screening, starting discussions on the outbound in investments, how we see in certain sectors, and even going small, but I think very important step further, which I'm sure in this country we will have to witness as well. Actually, looking into what we do as a research projects and in science, because science and the research can be as well quite sensitive and dual use. So this is these are approaches which I think it's really quite close, and we have actually a format, TTC, Trade and Technology Council, between EU and US, where we definitely have a possibility to discuss and to compare, not only to discuss, but actually to compare our notes.
Ambassador Louis, you served in China. Anything you want to add about Singapore's approach to China or cooperation with the US on these issues?
Well, I think Singapore, as a small country, obviously would want to be friend with all countries, near and far, big and small. We're mindful of the sensitivities in the US-China relationship, especially over trade and investments in sensitive areas. I think the world has gone from one where the operating paradigm was interdependence to one where we are acutely mindful of overdependence, right? And hence now you're really trying to untangle some of that interdependence to try and find ways to make your supply chains, your trade relations more robust. And that's understandable. Today, it is more focusing on a particular country and whether, for example, the US may be over-reliant on that country. I suspect that in time to come, it wouldn't just be focusing on countries, but companies from that country, whether it is operating within that country or outside of that country. And so you will have second-order, secondary-order effects that will have to be studied further in the years to come. Singapore is a hub for investments around the world. Significant part of it comes from the US, as I already mentioned, but Japan, from the EU, and a growing number of Chinese companies are also coming into Singapore. And so Singapore will have to be mindful of some of these sensitivities and to be able to tread the needle very, very carefully. We still believe that we can be a place where there's cross-pollination of ideas and people, but increasingly we must also guard against cross-pollution. And in areas where commingling should not take place, then it is very important, I think, for Singapore to ensure that there are safeguards in place where that commingling is going to be as separate as we can make it.
Wonderful thing. Ambassador Moctezuma, we are coming up on the sunset review of USMCA in 2026, and the parties have already begun conversations around that. Jay Timmons was just saying that the U.S. has some issues, and Mexico has issues, and Canada has a few issues. I expect some of these issues around national security will be part of that conversation. How do you see the sunset review playing out, and can you just highlight some of the key themes?
Well, I think that USMCA is a success story. The three countries can tell you that. And what I believe is that we have to stop looking at the trees and start looking at the forest, which is the future of the US and the future of the region. I'm going to give you just an example. If you look at the production and of transportation equipment, if we see manufacturing in the world, China produces 9.8% of the world's transportation equipment, which means planes and trains and ships and everything. The US produces 7.6. So China already past the production and the manufacturing capacities of the US. But if you sum up Mexico, which produces 6.4, and Canada, 2.9, then you have 16.9. So when North America produces 16.9, that's much more than 9.8. So what we should be thinking is about the medium and long-term view of where do we want to get as a region, as the North American region. I think that we're giving very strong steps toward that future with the Chips and Science Act and with the Anti-Inflationary Act, when they are giving credit, fiscal credits to products that are produced in North America. Because I think that the North American region has to be seen as a unit, and that means that, as you said, foreign policy and trade must be looked not together, but as one common effort. And what I'm really optimistic about is that I believe that shared values and the fight for freedom and democracy in the world will be led by North America, which I'm sure it will become the most competitive and humanistic region in the world.
Wonderful. And I know you're here in DC watching our presidential campaign play out very closely. And of course, we're watching your presidential campaign play out. Are trade issues a big part of your presidential campaign? And if so, what are the issues in debate in Mexico?
In Mexico, campaigns have not officially started. There are candidates, and the two main forces have a woman as candidate, so we will have a woman president for the first time in history. But campaigns have not started. And of course, trade is a very, very important issue. We trade with the US about 70% of our trade. And from our GDP, 80% is manufacturing and trade. So it's very, very important for us.
Yes, wonderful. Ambassador Crespo-Sancho, one of the interesting approaches the Biden administration has taken is to, instead of negotiating traditional binding trade agreements, they're pursuing these novel trade frameworks in both the Indo-Pacific and in our region. Can you just talk about that approach? What are your sort of main ambitions for the Americas partnership, and what do you think is possible using this kind of novel framework?
Interestingly enough, Costa Rica will be hosting next year the meeting 2025 in the APEC meeting. And also, President Chavez accepted a leader, he's going to take on a leadership role within APEC. And also there is a possibility where they're discussing about which other countries are going to be part of APEC. So we're not the only countries that are in right now, but there are other countries, there's a possibility that them joining. So there's a lot of interesting things happening with APEC. And the last meeting was November. So that November, many of the presidents of the region were here. They were discussing what are the next steps. Costa Rica has two main kind of sectors. One is the commerce and trade, and the other one is more kind of the foreign relations. And those are the two tracks that we're kind of joining, or that we're leading per se. We're also leading the one on the Center for Excellence, which is related to CHIPS Act money. So ITC funds is also related to that. And Costa Rica is going to be hosting, every country will have its own responsibility, but Costa Rica is hosting the Center for Excellence related to technology for a regional Center for Excellence, which, as you all know, probably, we do not have, even the United States, and I think that's also a problem worldwide, that there are not sufficient people with the necessary skills for technology jobs. So I think the last numbers, and if I'm not mistaken, there's about a lack of 300,000 people in Latin America. with those skills. So that regional hub, which is already moving into Costa Rica, and the government is taking it on. Intel is helping us already. They're giving us a chunk of money to make a virtual lab. And they're going to be a cloud lab. There's going to be 3 overall labs within Costa Rica. So the people in Latin America, from Mexico, from Argentina, from everywhere, can go there, train, and help the region overall. Because in the US, there's also a lack of skills. So we're all having those same issues. So that is what, let's say, Costa Rica is doing with APEP. However, we also have, we see APEP as a great opportunity when things are not as open as we wish they were in issues related to trade. Then we have to look for other venues. And I think APEP is a good other venue to start with. So we'll have to see how it evolves and how it actually, we want to see results. That's what Costa Rica is trying to, and I think all the other countries, members of APEP, that's what we're looking for, results.
Wonderful. I have one final question for Ambassador Luis, and then I want to take some time to open it up to the audience. But I did want to get to digital trade, Singapore's the role that Singapore is playing in that. Your FTA with Chile and New Zealand has become a standard for digital trade agreements. Can you just talk for a minute about the future of digital trade as you see it?
Maybe if you permit me to take a step back to talk actually about the new economic architecture that is being envisioned in our part of the world in the Indo-Pacific. You have the CPTPP, all of you are familiar with it. The US is not present. China is knocking on the doors and hoping to be admitted. You have the RCEP that was initiated by ASEAN to bring together our main dialogue partners in Asia. And so we have China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The US is not in it. We've got the DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that you just mentioned, initiated by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. South Korea is on the verge of being admitted. China is knocking on the doors, so too Canada and Costa Rica. The US is not in it. There is a danger that the US is absent from all the economic architectures that is being developed in our part of the world. And if you then look ahead 20, 30 years down the road, what does that portend for US relations with Asia and with the Indo-Pacific? Which is why Singapore so deeply invested in IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Not because we see huge benefits for us economically, because we already have bilateral free trade agreements with almost everybody, but because we believe that the US cannot afford to be absent economically from our part of the world. To your point, digital economy partnership agreements, we believe that clean economy agreements, DPAs, going to be the way forward. So there is that trilateral with New Zealand, with Chile. We've got bilaterals with the UK, with Australia, with South Korea. We've got a clean economy agreement with Australia. We believe that there are going to be benefits for some of these new agreements, particularly when it pertains to SMEs. Right, which is obviously also a cause for some interest and concern within the United States. And we believe that we need to work together on establishing the rules, the standards, and when necessary, even the safeguards to make sure that digital economy transactions and integration can take place in a structured, rules-based manner going forward.
Great, thank you, and very compelling points about the importance of U.S. engagement in the region. So I want to ask the audience to come in now with any questions. I see a question here on the front table.
Hi, I'm Barbara Simmons. I'm Vice Chair of the International Law Section for the National Bar. We are in talks with the African Continental Free Trade Area to enter into an MOU, and I was pleased to see that Ambassador Tai has signed, the U.S. has signed an agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area. My question for the ambassadors is, what do you see as your short and long-term relationship with Africa, acknowledging that it is a continent, not a country, in terms of trade and how that serves as a foreign policy approach?
Ambassador Neliupšienė, you want to take that one?
Well, thank you for the question. It's not really the secret that EU considers Africa as the neighbor, not neighborhood, but neighbor, and the relations are really for quite some time has been very stable. But of course, we are talking about continent, so there are security issues, questions about democracy and rule of law. But EU is the biggest contributor for the international partnership, and in other words, development. And I think that actually really paves the way for the bigger trade or more broader trade relations. There is another huge project which actually EU is changing the mindset and moving on, is the Global Gateway, the huge project which supposed to encourage partnerships, not only government to government, but as well private business and financial institutions, to partnership in the huge infrastructural, first of all, projects, which may then pave the way for the really more favorable trade and commerce relations. So I think that if it works, we would be in the absolutely different future of our commercial relations in 3 to 5 years.
Wonderful. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Doug Palmer with Politico. This is for the Mexican ambassador. Actually, I had gotten an email just the other day from a reader asking me if I'd heard about a rumor that the Mexican government was going to put forward an executive order to increase tariffs. And I hadn't heard about it, but here I am today, and I thought I would take the opportunity to ask you, is there some new Mexican government tariff action coming down the pike?
Not that I know.
I think we've got one.
Yes, here we go.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Khushbu from the South China Morning Post. I have 2 questions. We talked about elections and we talked about tariffs. I just wanted to ask you, when former President Donald Trump was a Republican favorite to get the nomination, when he says, I'll put 10% tariffs, 60% tariffs, NATO is not an ally, how do you view that? Is there nervousness? Are you already thinking about how you're going to deal with the tariffs if they come into place? And how tariffs like those actually impact what we're talking about, trade as foreign policy? And I have a specific question for Ambassador from Singapore. You talked about Chinese companies coming to Singapore. And recently we saw, one of those companies is TikTok, and we recently saw the CEO of TikTok being grilled. Some of the questions that were being asked were, some of the Singaporeans thought that were racist. How does, a grilling like that, some questions like that impact what we're talking about, trade as, foreign policy, if someone from Singapore is repeatedly asked if he works for the Chinese Communist Party? Thank you.
Do you want to take the 10% impact of 10% tariffs first? I thought you got off easy with Doug's question. So what is the impact of a 10%?
Well, that would be
across the board.
That would be very, very. It will hinder the whole relationship because it's against free trade, and it's against the North American region. Mm-hmm. What I truly believe is that the future of Mexico, Canada, and the United States is to become allies and to really work together in a much higher view about the world's development. Because we're not just sharing goods and services, we're sharing also values. And when you start taking down the foundations of free trade, which is the one that put us in this condition to work together, I think that's not a very good idea.
Yeah. Anything to add on the TikTok?
We know Senator Cotton well. He's visited Singapore. We hold him in high regard. I think we've also got to see the line of questioning that he took and the remarks that he made subsequently from two angles. One, of course, this is election season, and they've got a domestic audience that they need to be able to not only understand the concerns and sensitivities, but also to find ways to address them, right? So that's one part of it. Two, I think it reflects some of the deep-seated concerns that the US may have over its trade relations with China, over companies in China, whether in China itself or coming out of China, that would hold a significant amount of data, possibly even sensitive data of US citizens. So there is a certain, I would say, something that can be understood, something that can be appreciated. I think, though, a line of question taken too far can sometimes possibly undermine the image and standing of how the US is viewed in different parts of the world, not just in Asia and not necessarily only in Singapore. So there's, I think, a fine balance that needs to be struck between some of the security sensitivities and also the overall image and impression that the US would want to continue to project and portray to the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Vanya Chen. I'm at Georgetown Law. I have a question for Ambassador Louis as well from Singapore. You were listing the free trade agreements of the region in Asia right now, and you were saying how the US is not a part of it or not even knocking on the door, whereas China is. And I was wondering, it seems like China wants to get in, right? So this position of what kind of compromises or what kind of concessions are the other countries that are already part of these agreements asking from China, or is there a position where you can ask for something? What kind of concessions, and can maybe the US or other regions learn from that or use that as well?
Well, I would say that I'm obviously not privy to the discussions that are taking place. There's a session working group started for China, as indeed for Canada, on the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And the one for China is chaired by Chile. We haven't gone to that stage yet for CPTPP. But across both of these agreements is the need for consensus by all current members to accept a new member. And that consensus will build on top of, number one, an assurance that an applicant can fully meet the standards. And number two, that the members are convinced that the applicant will faithfully abide by the commitments that it signs up to. So we believe that those are standards that we will not compromise on, and how the discussions with any particular applicant will shape up, I think it's for the working groups to deal with.
Great, thank you. Well, in the panel just before us, Jay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I
sorry,
just one sentence is. It's very good, of course, to have a regional agreements, especially having in mind the topics which goes much beyond any single continent like e-commerce or digital trade. But I do believe we have really to be sure, as the like-minded countries here and as they're sharing the same values, that the most important format for arranging the global agreements and having a global format is actually WTO. If we don't manage to do all of us, then it should be multilateral. And I think that everyone has to be on board. And I think that if the like-minded countries can set standards for that, we will be all better off than regionalizing ourselves. And hopefully, U.S. will actively join on that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to give you the last word. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Ken, for having us.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, ambassadors.
Thank you.
Really great note for us to end this panel on, with a directive for us all to work together. We talked about that. Our opening session yesterday was with Angela Ellard, the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, talking about the upcoming MC13. I know we're all looking forward to that. So thank you all very much for joining us. For those of you in the room, I'd like to welcome you to go get lunch. If you can smell it already, we can already smell it here in the room. It's the buffet lunch. We're going to bring it back in here, and we're having a little break, and then at about 12:15 p.m., we're going to restart for our last session of the conference with Congressman Adrian Smith, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Thank you all. Thank you, ambassadors, and we'll see you back up here in a few minutes.